And can you basically give me kind of the hypothesis of this theory of keeping freedom nationally but not having virtue imposed by the federal government?
Right. The answer really for political strategy for conservatives is freedom nationally, virtue locally. The only way we're really going to get social conservatism is locally, because the federal government in the last several decades has lapsed into an idea that they're the definer and enforcers of personal virtue. That's why we have healthcare legislation. That's why they're outlawing light bulbs, the common light bulb. That's why they want sex education for our kids in public schools. They've decided that they're the enforcer and definer of virtues. What we need to do as conservatives is simply get back to the Constitution and say the federal government doesn't define and enforce virtues. Whether those are conservative virtues or liberal virtues, what we can do is own our own virtues. We do it individually, we do it in our families, we do it in our churches, we do it in our communities.
Now, one thing when I think about social issues for conservatives, I do think about the abortion issue and kind of how that relates to the federal government level, and they've been the ones who've been really kind of imposing it and driving the debate. So what would you say to someone like that who said a social issue like abortion probably would need to be handled at the federal level? What's your take on that?
Well, of course, that's the burning social issue of our time is abortion. I call it virtue cramdowns when the federal government steps in and decides what's best for everybody about virtue. And Roe v. Wade, of course, was the ultimate virtue cramdown, where the Supreme Court said, hey, we know better about what virtue means, and we're going to override all those states who said that abortion was a crime. So in essence, the whole idea of freedom nationally, virtue locally is exactly the way abortion should be handled. That Roe v. Wade would have never come into play, or it gets overturned, and then state by state it's decided whether or not abortion is a crime. In many places it'll be considered a crime, in other places it won't be, and then now we're down to the state level, which is what it should be, and then we fight that battle then. And then even more so, what we should do is then say we need to change hearts and minds. If we're in a state where abortion is still pro-choice, even after Roe v. Wade, we need to change hearts and minds about abortion and reduce the incidence of it by convincing individuals.
So you're comfortable with keeping that issue at the state level?
Absolutely.
As opposed to just outlawing it completely at the federal level?
Yeah, I think what happens is the federal government, anytime it gets involved with crimes that aren't explicitly federal crimes, where there's something across state lines or treason or something like that, with the secularized government that we have, they'll end up getting it wrong. They'll end up making laws that don't make sense. And so, in other words, everything that can be pushed down needs to be pushed down, and abortion is just like any other major crime, murder, rape, it's determined at the state level.
I know something that's been in the news a lot recently too is this anti-bullying, I guess, kind of measure that people are taking into account. How does that fit into your theory, or is there a particular social issue or topic that you think is kind of the marquee example of this philosophy?
Well, there are a number of marquee issues that are against this philosophy, and it's what has conservatives upset. Examples are the healthcare initiative, clearly unconstitutional to force us to do something. Almost everything to do with the federal government getting involved in education is a problem. They're having diet issues about what ought to be eaten in our public schools. They want to have 6-year-olds taught sex education from the federal mandate. Well, schools should always be local, including bullying. Local schools need to be handled by local school boards with local accountability. That's the only way that you'll get quality schools. The federal government has no business in it. So a whole plethora of issues in education, social justice, and environmentalism should be state or local issues. And we're just used to dealing with them. We all have a carbon footprint, so suddenly the federal government tells us, you're not virtuous enough, you need to change your behavior environmentally, etc. So if you take any particular issue the government's in, it typically is a virtue issue. That's where we've gotten off track. We shouldn't promote it. Even as social conservatives, what we must do is say, we will handle virtues locally. We will fight for freedom nationally, because almost anything the federal government touches is not friendly to traditional values. Yeah. We need to say, get out of that. We will handle locally. And guess what, Elizabeth? Texas will look a lot different than Massachusetts. Just like Rhode Island, when Roger Williams founded it about 380 years ago, is a lot different than the Puritans, Massachusetts. That's the American way. Las Vegas is different than an Amish community. That's virtue.
Slightly, yeah.
Yes, that's virtue locally. That's what the American way really is. And if we as social conservatives want to build our communities, it shouldn't be with the interference of federal government. And if we don't like the way San Francisco functions, we need to go there and change it and not try to do a virtue cram down. We should never want the federal government in the virtue business. It leads to disaster. It happened in Europe, and it's happening here now.
Just briefly, as far as your background goes, what got you interested in this? Was there some sort of incident where, I mean, did you see something with your kids at school that made you think about this?
I'm a fellow at the Centennial Institute, which is the think tank on faith, family, and freedom. Before that, I started doing debates with conservative Christians about all these types of issues. And we started talking about, in one of our sessions, it's a debate forum, about virtue versus freedom and what the federal government should do. The federal government never handles virtue properly. We have a committee of 535 people in Congress. They cannot define virtue properly. They can't even act virtues, let alone define our own virtues. And the bureaucracy cannot possibly enforce virtue properly. So we had that debate, and we realized no matter how much we want to preserve our country as social conservatives or Christian conservatives, it's not going to get there from the federal government. Those become rules that get converted to non-traditional values issues anyway. What we have to do is bind together a coalition of fiscal conservatives, libertarians, social conservatives who are binding together to fight for freedom nationally, and then we may disagree what that means locally. We may disagree about whether a strip club goes next to the elementary school, but we can be allies in saying that freedom is what we're supposed to be watching for and preserving at the federal level. We as social conservatives, I think, we have noble goals. We want a free country and we want a virtuous country. But you don't get both coming from the federal government, because as they try to define virtue, you get radical environmentalism, you get weird social justice ideas, and they take away our freedoms as they're defining fake virtues. So I got involved with this as we started discussing it out in Denver, Colorado, where we get a lot of Washington virtues coming our way.
Yeah.
And we said, essentially, we've decided that we need to fight for freedom nationally, and as social conservatives, we need to fight out the battles locally or statewide, the way it's been designed for almost 400 years in America. That's what really works. There's a relief valve that Las Vegas is Las Vegas and Denver is Denver, and if we want to go change it, we can. But we've been sucked into this battle that we need to win with our virtues nationally. One quick example, when President Bush did his White House Office of Faith-Based Initiatives, many conservatives and Christians applauded that. They said, finally, we're getting some value. In his memoir, he said that, in essence, the goal was to, in fact, to move federal pork over to churches and charities. Now, under the Obama administration, what has happened is that he now says it's for seculars, and it's for Hindus and Buddhists, and now it's just another federal program. Social conservatives often when they do get a piece of legislation in, it ends up being converted to non-traditional value purposes. We need to fight every piece of social issue legislation for ever being a national issue, and then fight for it locally. It's the only way social conservatism can win, and it's the only way that it works. You don't get social conservatism from Congress saying we ought to behave a particular way. We get social conservatism from a mom and dad making sure their kids in at curfew time.
I'd much rather look at my mom and dad for a model of virtues if there's any congressmen. So yeah,
absolutely.
I agree with you on that. Thank you so much. I really appreciate
you for
speaking
having
with
me,
us
Elizabeth.
and sharing your ideas with us. Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Alrighty.